When we talk about the public policy cycle, we're referring to the process by which items or problems or issues somehow get put on somebody's political agenda, and that whether or not the government is going to address that depends on how the problem is defined. Once we address that, then we try to figure out, or people who want policies made, try to figure out what they actually want the government to do, and then later on those policies get evaluated for the impact. So over here we have the agenda setting, and that's where people define a problem. Once a problem is defined and somebody says, hey, the government ought to be involved in that, then we get to policy formulation, where somebody makes proposals about what they think solutions to possible problems are, and debate is held both in the public arena and in government circles. Once the government adopts a policy, and if they're going to do something about it, then that policy has to be implemented. This is where we're really going to start off today. Policy implementation is when we put the policy into effect as a government. And then finally, once a policy is put into effect, it is supposed to have some kind of an impact on the phenomenon that prompted it in the first place. So then we evaluate whether a policy has the desired effect, or whether it makes things worse, or if it has no change. At each stage of the process, we have institutions that are involved in the policy process. So you have individuals who are involved, you have organizations involved, Congress might be involved, the president, some bureaucratic agencies, might be interest groups that get involved in terms of prompting some interest or prompting some action on the part of the government, or trying to keep government out of doing things. And then you have the different rules of their behavior in which we identify the things that people can and can't do in terms of the policy-making process. This is all very cyclical, because once we have a policy in place and we evaluate what the impact of it has been, then presumably the government will revisit that at some future date. So let's review, first of all, very quickly what agenda setting and policy formulation look like. I'm not going into as much detail as I did in the first part of the class. Then we're going to move into a little bit more detail in terms of policy implementation, the costs of policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. Just as a reminder, when we're talking about agenda setting, the whole process of figuring out whether the government is or is not going to do something with relation to a problem depends on whether any particular human situation is recognized as a problem. So we start out with objective conditions in society. This could be something as simple as pollution, or homelessness, or poverty. For some worldviews, it might even be there's too much wealth in the hands of too few people. Now, when these situations occur, they either may or may not be recognized as a particular problem. So, if they're not recognized as existing, then obviously the government isn't going to step in and do anything. If at some point a condition gets defined as a problem, it gets recognized as a situation, then somebody says, hey, this is bad, then we can move on. But for many years, for many decades, or maybe even many centuries, there are certain situations that occur in every society that weren't often seen as something that the government had to do anything about. We talked about that in previous sessions. Once a situation is recognized as an issue, recognized as a condition, then defined as a problem, then there has to be somebody who perceives that the civil government ought to be involved in managing the response to the situation. So take, for example, the problem of pollution. There has always been pollution. Human beings and animals and have always been generating carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. We've always had a problem with what to do with human waste. So it's always been there. The question is, did it become recognized as a situation that somebody ought to do something about? And different communities dealt with this in different ways. They might say, all right, there's a section outside of town where you can dump your garbage or take care of your waste. After a while, it may be not have been seen as a problem, as something that anybody had to really do anything about. It's just people kind of handle it on their own. But once the pollution became defined as a problem, then people said, all right, well, if it's a problem, if this is a bad thing, then maybe somebody ought to do something. For a long time, people were responsible for dealing with their own pollution, dealing with their own waste. After a while, cities and communities took it upon themselves to handle this. So, for example, when we had cholera outbreaks in the Middle Ages in cities like London, this is what led to the city government saying we need to establish a better sanitation system. Once something has been recognized as a problem, defined as a problem, and then there's a perception that the civil government ought to do something about it, then we start to see that the government will see it as something that has to be on its agenda. But that usually doesn't happen all at once. Somebody usually has to define the problem publicly and publicize it to decision makers. So part of getting on the agenda of of politicians and of the government means that somebody has to say to somebody in government, you ought to do something. Or this is something that somebody in government ought to manage. Or we can't handle this on our own. Or it's gotten so bad that we have to take some action and the government is the way we want to do this. So defining any kind of a social condition in such a way as that it's going to get on the government's agenda requires that it exists, requires somebody perceiving government action, and this usually involves the political elites then becoming aware that a problem exists and that somebody wants them to do something about it. Moreover, it often is the case that we need some change in the public's awareness of the problem. Perhaps the government or people in the government want to do something, but if there isn't public support for doing something, it seems to be unlikely, especially in governments that are representative in nature, that the government is going to respond to something or do something about which the public isn't really aware. Sometimes this requires catalytic events. And what we mean by a catalytic event is some urgent situation that quickly brings it to people's minds or to the government's minds. We discussed, for example, the situation at Love Canal, in which toxic waste dumps were discovered. And this was a catalytic event to lead to greater federal government involvement in environmental cleanups. Sometimes it involves political entrepreneurs, people who personally invest the time, energy, and resources into getting something onto the political agenda. The example that we used here was Candy Lightner and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. At each stage of the political process, in order to get something on the agenda or get it adopted by the government, people will oftentimes have to overcome political gatekeepers, that is, people who have the ability to say no at any given point in time in the policy process. The example we used here was something that happened here in Michigan recently, in which a representative from the east side of the state tried to propose more vigorous homeschooling regulations, and the Republican state senator who was in charge of the education committee in the state senate said she can propose it, but this is never going to see the light of day. That is, he's never going to allow a vote on it. Well, he's a gatekeeper. He has the power to say no. And gatekeepers occur at various places in the political process. So once a policy issue is on the government's agenda, then you have to have the problem of policy formulation. That is, what exactly is it that we want done, or that some group of people want done? So the problem has to be defined, and then some kind of a change in government policy has to be proposed as a solution. The example that we used in class was the idea of a few years ago, where there was an increase in crime in South Grand Rapids, and there were community meetings being held in which people were debating what to do about it. The solutions that they proposed often hinged on the way they defined the problems. So for people who said the real problem is juvenile delinquency, the solution involves some kind of a set of programs for dealing with delinquent youth, maybe giving them harsher community service. If the problem is lack of parental control, then some people said that the solution to this is perhaps better parenting classes, having social institutions such as churches set up programs to help teach parents. Some people said that teens had too much free time on their hands, so the solution then would be after-school programs, maybe better employment opportunities for teenagers. Some people simply said it's because of drugs in the community, and this meant that their solutions had to do with more vigorous enforcement of drug enforcement laws and a stronger police presence in the neighborhoods where there was a lot of violence. In all of these cases, The solution definition, that is what was going to happen in the community or what the government was going to do, depended on the actions that people wanted to take to respond to the way the problems had been defined. One of the key questions is which institution should take action in order to change this. If you're talking about dealing with drugs, that's clearly a police matter. On the other hand, if the problem is parental control, perhaps the problem is better parenting classes that can be done by institutions that are not actually the government. At all points, the question is the issue that we're talking about something that can be best addressed by the government? There are some issues that can be best addressed by the government, and there are some issues that can't. We just have to be aware that government is an option, but it's not usually the only option, and sometimes it certainly isn't the best option. When we think about policy formulation, we have to think about the things that we're asking the government to do. Anybody who's proposing a government solution, whatever their ideas are, it has to compete with some other ideas. The first idea is no government action. This is the default position of government. The government is not going to do something on any particular action. Any solution has to compete with this inaction, which, by the way, is also a policy. If the government is not going to act to deal with a certain situation, that inaction is a policy. Another thing that proposed solutions have to deal with are current governance regimes. And a regime is defined as the existing rules for handling similar problems. So if there's a set of rules for dealing with casual drugs, such as marijuana, then that sets up a certain set of expectations about how the government is going to handle other kinds of situations, perhaps relating to harder drugs. Oftentimes, proposed solutions have to deal with competing ideologies. Conservative solutions are going to be different from liberal solutions. And, as in any case, when a group of people define something as a problem, if they define it differently, they're going to come up with different proposed solutions. So the people who define the problem in Grand Rapids as a problem of too much free time on the kids' hands, they're going to come up with a different set of solutions than people who say that it's really about dealing with the drug trade in the area. Those are two different solutions to two different problems, and they're competing with one another. Any proposed solution that's really going to be considered by the government has to address current laws and policies, that is, the current governance regime related to a particular issue. It has to think about who in the government is best positioned to act. This is called agency responsibility. So if we're dealing with parents who don't know how to parent, then perhaps we're looking at Child Protective Services or family services that bring kids and families into the social welfare system, into the social welfare and social work communities. Proposed solutions have to think through rules for implementation. If you're going to do something, what exactly does that look like? Do you have more vigorous enforcement? Do you have required penalties for breaking the law? And so forth. Of course, there's nothing free. And so whenever you're asking the government to do something new, and it involves hiring a new person to do a new job or to set up a new office somewhere, that all has to be paid for. This is the question of funding. And then more and more frequently over the last generation or so, we've seen a lot more laws and policy efforts that include sunset provisions. A sunset provision is when a law automatically dies if it's not renewed. So you might have a government in 2050 that says we're going to deal with this, we're going to take a more vigorous role in this, but when we look at 2020, if the government doesn't agree to keep this program going, then this program gets shut down. That's a sunset provision. Once you have policy that gets adopted, then the question is, how are you actually going to implement that policy? So at the end of the policy formulation process, there's really a decision point. Is the government going to do something or not? If the government does something, what does that look like? It looks like the legislative body writing a law and passing a law with the cooperation of the executive to do something. And so once that happens, and there's an agreement about that, the way that policy gets formulated then actually has to be put into effect. Passing a law but not giving it the means to be implemented is is not very useful. So what does policy implementation look like? Well, the parts of the government that are responsible for implementing policy are usually called the bureaucracy, or they're housed in government agencies. So these organizations, these organisms within the government, are the ones where most people work, and where they're the ones who actually on a day-to-day basis have responsibility for putting a law into effect. When Congress passes a law, it has some vague ideas in mind about what it is asking the government to do. But when a bureaucracy has to implement a law, it needs to have some kind of a basis for actually doing the things that Congress asked it to do. So, for example, in the Affordable Care Act passed in 2009, Congress passed a huge bill with a lot of details in it, but they couldn't cover all the possible details for making the law work. They delegated that authority to the Department of Health and Human Services. So the head of that agency then tasks her bureaucrats for writing rules for putting this law into effect in a way that affects Americans on a day-to-day basis. Moreover, the implementation of these laws involves something that's called discretionary authority. Discretionary authority is basically the flexibility that bureaucrats have in enforcing the law. Let me give you two examples. The first one is a police officer who is responsible for using a radar gun to track down speeders. Now, when you're driving down the highway and the speed limit's 70 and you're going faster than 70 and you drive past a police officer, people are automatically going to get nervous. Why? Because they're driving faster than the speed limit is on the road. They know that that police officer, if they're tracking the speed at which I'm driving, they know the police officer is within his or her authority to write a ticket for speeding. Now, whether the officer actually does write a ticket for speeding is up to their discretion. So, for example, you might be able to go 71 or 72 or 73 miles an hour, and the police officer can look at that and say, that's not somebody that I'm going to write a ticket on. I'm going to wait for somebody who's going 85 or 90 miles an hour. So they have some discretion over the extent to which and how vigorously they enforce speed laws. Another example would be in terms of pollution enforcement. Let's say that smokestacks of a particular kind of factory are limited in terms of how much pollution they're allowed to put out. Well, it may be that the bureaucrats in charge of monitoring the pollution in that coming out of smokestacks have some flexibility in terms of how vigorously they're going to hold those companies accountable for exactly how much pollution comes out. So they may have some flexibility in that. That's called discretionary authority. Now, Congress in the national level is ultimately responsible for overseeing the bureaucracy. Remember separation of powers. Congress writes the laws. The president's responsibility is to execute the laws. And he executes the laws through the bureaucracy. But Congress almost always has authority to oversee what the bureaucracy does. Now, in general, what political scientists have found is that Congress does this to a certain extent, and they don't usually make a big deal out of it. The only time that Congress really makes a big deal out of it is if somebody gets very excited or a big controversy happens. So security at embassies wasn't really a big deal. Nobody really thought that much about it until one of our embassies was attacked in Libya a few years ago. Once that happened and four Americans were killed in this controversy, in this attack at the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, that's an alarm. Somebody said, hey, there's a big emergency here. Then Congress holds all kinds of high-profile hearings to oversee the problems that were related to providing security at these embassies. Again, I want to emphasize that when Americans have some expectation that the government is going to do something, what goes along with that is we have to realize that costs money. Anytime you have to hire somebody or staff an office or move an office or buy office equipment, then you have to pay for that. This doesn't happen for free. So the question is, who's going to pay for the thing that we're asking government to do? And when we're thinking about who's going to pay, we're asking who's going to benefit from what we're asking the government to do. So these are two sides of the same coin. Who's going to pay for this and who's going to benefit? A couple of different questions need to be asked. First, how much money is going to be needed to implement a certain policy? When the president proposes his budget and he says these are the priority things that I would like to accomplish, he has to attach a dollar amount to that. Then how much money is going to be spent? That's a question for Congress. They said, yes, the president asked for this much money. We're going to give him this amount of money instead. So if the president asks for $1 million to do something, Congress is within its authority to give him only $500,000 or not to give him any money whatsoever. So these are two different questions. How much money is needed to do something as opposed to how much money is actually allocated to be spent on that thing. Once you have a bill, an estimated cost for that, then the question is, where is that money going to come from? Really, there are only a few ways that governments have of raising money. One is by raising taxes. One is by charging fees for services. One is by cost shifting, that is by taking money from one agency and giving it to another agency. And then a third option, obviously, is to borrow it. If you don't have enough money to do the things you want to do, then the government has the authority to borrow money up to a certain point. Key central point here is that the more the government does, the more money it has to raise. It has to come up with that money somehow. I think this chart will help to illustrate some of the concerns as we think about how much it costs to make the government run. Now, what I'm showing you here is a chart of this is total federal government expenditures. That is, how much money is the federal government spending? This does not include state governments or local governments. This is just the federal government in Washington, D.C. So how much have they been spending over the years on things, and what percentage is that line item as part of the regular budget? So when we're looking at this 100% scale here, what this reflects is we're talking about 100% of the money that the government spends in a specific year. So back here, we can look at the first year is 1948. It's not labeled, but it's 1948. So in 1948, you can see how much money is spent in these 5 different areas. We get to 1973, for example, you can see this red area is a certain amount, green area, purple, that tells us what percentage of the budget is spent on specific things. So what the government spends money on tells us something about its commitments and its priorities. So let's look at the most recent year. The most recent year for which we have data here is 2012. What does this chart tell us? Well, in 2012, this red section tells us that about 20% of the budget was spent on defense and international affairs. Now keep in mind that we were still in the middle of 2 wars. Now this green section here is money that is called net interest. That is, on the money that the government has been borrowing, how much is being spent on paying the interest on the money that has been borrowed. The purple section here, it reflects Social Security and Medicare payments. You can see over time the big change that has taken place in this, from the 1950s, where it was a relatively small percentage of the budget, to the last 20 years when it has become one of the largest sections of the government of the federal budget. We can see a different change that takes place in this defense and international affairs category. We can see that between 1951 and 1971, that this was by far the largest chunk of money spent by the federal government, but those are the years leading from the Korean War through the Vietnam War. And by the time you get to the end of the Vietnam War, that percentage of money being spent on defense and international affairs is dramatically decreasing. This light blue section is other kinds of individual payments. So this might include payments toward on social welfare programs such as temporary aid for needy families, food stamps, those kinds of things. And you can see that over the last 40 years or so, this has remained a fairly constant, perhaps 30% of the federal budget. And then finally, this orange section here is just other federal spending related to different areas. So what you can see is that over time, how the government spends its money has really changed. Back in the 1950s and the 1960s, a lot more money was spent on defense. A significant chunk, 10 to 12% of what the government spends, is going to pay off debt. The purple section shows us that over time, the commitment that the government has made to pay Social Security and Medicare, that is, this is only retirement insurance for senior citizens. That's the purple section, and you can see how much that's grown, and it's expected to grow more in the coming years. This blue line has also dramatically increased, with increases in food stamps, increases in social welfare payments, especially after the mid-1960s. We see a big jump in that. And then also you have an increase in that in terms of Medicaid payments, which is health care insurance for poor people. So let's look at this information in a slightly different way. This chart shows us a summary of the amount of money that the government takes in, how much money it spends, and then how much of a deficit there is. Let's first look at this blue line here. This blue line, keeping the dollar constant, taking into account the fact that the dollar changes in value over time, this is marked in 2009 dollars. This blue line tells us, when you compare all these years, how much money has the government spent. And you can see that starting back here in the 1940s, the government was spending a lot less money than it is now. And we have a dramatic increase that takes place in the 1990s in terms of how much money the government is spending. We see a little bit of a dip in the early 2000s, and then we're back up in terms of how much we're spending. And then this is the projected amount of spending in the next few years. The other thing I want you to point out to here is, yes, that's the spending the government is doing is the red line. The red line is the spending. The blue line is the income. So how much money does the government take in is the blue line. How much it spends is the red line. Now, you might notice that for most of the last 40 or 50 years, let's say in the last 30 years, the government has been spending more than it has been earning. When that happens, that's called a deficit. So here we have this defined as a deficit equals income minus spending. And you can see that over time, we have increased in our spending, but the government's income has increased too, but just not enough to keep up with the spending. So in any given year, this difference between the two is called the deficit. This green line points out or measures for us the deficit. So this is the difference between income and spending. And you can see that we had a small deficit for most of the era following World War II, following Vietnam, following Korea, Vietnam, and then it started to increase a little bit in the 1980s. Things got a little bit better in the late 1990s, and then the deficit has really decreased, has really changed a lot in the last several years, so that each year this is the difference between how much the government is spending versus how much it takes in. This section here is how much money the government has to borrow. You could look at it as the gap between these two lines. The difference between what you make and what you spend. You have to find that money somewhere. That is, you borrow it. So when we look at this over time, in 2014 as a specific example, which is marked here with this line, the federal government took in about $2.8 trillion dollars, and it spent about $3.2 trillion. The difference between the two is $447 billion. So you can see that is this gap right here. That's the difference. So the income was about nearly half a trillion dollars less than what we asked the government to spend. Well, when you have this deficit year after year after year, those things accumulate over time. That's called debt. So debt is the accumulated amount of deficits over time. This blue line shows us how much the debt has accumulated over time. You can see that for a while we were at a relatively low level of debt, that is, these accumulated deficits, but beginning in the 1980s we started borrowing more and more money that we weren't paying back, and even though the pace decreased for a little while, that amount has just grown and grown and grown. So by 2015, the total amount of debt, and I checked this last week, the total amount of debt that we owe is $18,627,577,000,000, give or take $1 million. That's how much the debt was in 2015, a little bit earlier this year. Now, most of this money is held by the public. That is, where the government borrow that money from. They borrow it from the public, mostly. So you have people who lend money to the government by buying what are called treasury bills. And so the government says, if you buy these bills, give us this cash, then in several years we promise to give you your money back plus interest. And so the interest, if you remember that interest section from the federal spending chart, that's how much, that's the money that's being paid out for money that has been previously borrowed. So most of the time, the money comes from the public somehow. Now I couldn't find this for this presentation, but a big chunk of that money is by private individuals, but a big chunk of it also is foreign governments. So the government of China, for example, is one of the lenders who is providing the U.S. government money to do the spending that it wants to do. And at some point, the spending is the payments are going to be demanded when it comes time when those things come mature. And after a while, if you don't pay your debts, then people are going to stop lending you money. Then you can see that there's some chunk of the federal debt that is held by the federal government itself. It's basically the federal government lending itself money, borrowing from one account and giving it to another account with the promise to pay it back. So in 2015, the government owed roughly $18.6 trillion. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's the money that the government needs to pay back at some point in time. Just by point of comparison, let's take a look at the current population. A few minutes ago, I checked the current population clock at census.gov, and there are approximately 321 million people living in the United States. Well, if you take that $18 trillion and divide it among the 321 million of us, that works out to $58,062.94 per person in government debt. At some point, somebody's going to want their money back. The question is, how is the government going to be able to sustain this over another generation? It seems to me very difficult that it can do that. All right. So now let's talk for the last few minutes about policy evaluation. The whole point of that last presentation was that when you ask the government to do something, you have to pay for it. And what the increasing amount of spending reflects is increasing demands on the government. Moreover, more and more of those demands are related to individual payments, such as through Social Security and social welfare programs and so forth. So those kinds of things are becoming a bigger and bigger part of what we expect from the government. Well, going back to policy more generally, if we're trying to solve certain social problems with our policies, then how good a job does the government's program do in terms of changing the policy or in terms of affecting the policy? For example, back during the Great Depression, one of the major problems that was identified was a problem of senior citizens who were extremely poor. And they hadn't saved very much for themselves for their retirement, and they went to retire or they stopped working, and they became destitute. Well, the question was, this has always been a problem, this has always been a situation. Somebody said it's too big a problem now, and the government ought to do something. And so the solution was, we're going to set up a system called Social Security, in which the government forces people to take money out of their paychecks in order to pay for their future retirement. So what are the effects of the policy? The effects of the policy is that we now have many fewer poor senior citizens, or at least abjectly poor. And so the solution of developing Social Security was, do you get rid of extreme poverty among senior citizens? So I think on the whole that has been basically successful, but the problem is, of course, that over time it's very difficult to sustain that program because you need a certain amount of workers paying into the system in order to support the people who are already receiving payments from the system. Now, who does this kind of evaluation in terms of whether or not a program works? Well, one group of people that looks at this are congressional committees. The Congress assigns overseeing certain bureaucracies and bureaucratic programs to certain committees, and they monitor what's going on. They ask for periodic updates to evaluate the programs. And so oftentimes government agencies are reporting back to Congress what they have done, what the effects of their program have been. Oftentimes these are internal evaluations. The agency itself does its own study to evaluate the impact of its own programs. Other times, external studies are done. That is, somebody from outside the government conducts studies in order to evaluate what the effects have been of a particular program. So let's say, for example, we're wanting to save the spotted owl. Well, you have a committee in Congress that's overseeing the bureaucratic agency responsible for saving the spotted owl, and then the government agency does a study on how many spotted owls there were before the program, how many are there after the program, and then try to evaluate whether the program has worked. Sometimes an environmental group will do its own study and do its own evaluation of what the effects of the policy have been. So at this stage of the game, they're collecting information to evaluate what the impact has been. In this process, you get some kind of a feedback. So part of the feedback is this information that comes from just objectively, in this condition that you are trying to address, what have been the effects. But there are other kinds of feedback. There's other kinds of feedback content that we can also look at. For example, there are people who might still challenge the policy. They might still say, this is not something we want the government to do, or this was the wrong way of going about it. Now, how are they going to look at the situation? They're going to look at whether you saved the spotted owl. Did the number of spotted owls increase? Well, then you can say the program was successful. But if the number of spotted owls actually decreases or has no impact, then people are going to challenge whether or not the policy was worth doing. Other aspects of the feedback are Congress members who face re-election. For example, it is sometimes the case that after difficult votes on the budget, the members of Congress have to go back and defend their votes to their constituents. Or it may be that a very unpopular program is passed by Congress and gets implemented, and the public is unhappy with that, and so they might penalize their member of Congress when he or she runs for re-election. The public sometimes can make a direct response. So the public itself then has the opportunity to weigh in on different parts of the policy and whether it's worked or not. And then finally, sometimes policies will be adjusted based upon the feedback that is received by the government. So when that happens, maybe something needs to be changed in the way that the approach to the problem was dealt with compared to what was original. Finally, it's the case, unfortunately, in terms of government programs, is that policies and programs established by the national government rarely stop. And it takes a lot of effort to get a policy or a program to stop acting. And this is why laws began to start including sunset provisions, that they would automatically stop unless somebody went back and reauthorized them. The general principle, though, is that once a government program has been implemented and has been started, then that policy is going to keep going. That program will keep going year after year after year, sometimes regardless of what the impact is, and sometimes regardless of what is good for the public. So, for example, I'm a big fan of the A-10 aircraft. My brother flies it. I think it's a great aircraft. I think it's a great idea in terms of providing close air support for our troops. But the United States Air Force said, no, we don't need the A-10 anymore. So they told Congress, we don't want this anymore. We don't need the A-10 anymore. Well, there were congressional hearings on whether we should keep the A-10. There were United States Air Force reports that were given. There were congressional staff reports that were given. There were external consultants brought in. But in the end, the A-10 continues to be funded, and part of this is because of who some of the gatekeepers are in the play, in this kind of a morality play. So one of the big supporters of the A-10 is Senator John McCain from Arizona. And so even though the United States Air Force says we don't want this airplane anymore, Senator McCain has said, if we get rid of this airplane, there are a lot of jobs in my state that are going to disappear. And he says, I think this is a good airplane to have regardless of what the Air Force says. So I'm going to keep the A-10 from being shut down. So this is an example of how somebody has an investment, whether it's at their state or in the bureaucracy. They have an investment in maintaining a program, even if there's not perceived to be a need for the program. So all of this goes into this overall cycle of the evaluation. We have people who identify some kind of an issue as needing to be addressed by somebody. Somebody somewhere along the line says, hey, the government ought to do something. Here's what we'd like the government to do. Let's formulate a policy that we want the government to do. And there's negotiation about what that looks like. And then when a policy is adopted, then it's put into effect. And that involves the government bureaucracy and oversight. And then finally, you have evaluation of the impact of that policy over time. Do you actually address the problem? So when you start thinking about what the government does or doesn't do, or what you want the government to do or not to do, you can think about it in terms of where is its place in this cycle. If it's something that the government's already doing, then you want to look at the policy evaluation stage of this to figure out whether or not the solution has been successfully found for the problem that was originally defined. Well, hopefully this is a really interesting, this is something that you found interesting and something that will help you to understand why politics works the way it does and how individuals can make a difference in the public policy cycle.